Good evening. I'm David Nicholas, and on CMU Public Television, a conversation with a senator elected to a second term this past November. We sit down with Judy Emmons next on Capitol Report.
Welcome to Capitol Report, a weekly discussion with your elected officials on the issues and concerns that affect you.
My guest this week was elected to 3 terms in the State House and then now has begun a second term in the State Senate in the 33rd District, Clare, Gratiot, Isabella, Mecosta, and Montcalm counties. Congratulations on that re-election, Senator Judy Emmons, and welcome back to Capitol Report.
Thank you so much, Dave. Pleasure.
As we sit down on a Friday for the audience that will be joining us on a Tuesday evening for this, but on our Friday morning, the news of late yesterday into this morning, the governor's announcement through executive order that he is taking the direct control or transferring the control over the state school reform office from the State Board of Education to the governor's office. One of the quotes said, to paraphrase slightly, that this was in the works for a long time. What was the mood of lawmakers in terms of a good move? What's your take on this?
Interesting. I think we all were not anticipating something like that, although we understand it. I know his goal has been to actually reform those low-performing districts, those especially in Southeast Michigan. We're looking at some real challenges. And there have been some frustrations along the way. I served on education last term. I was frustrated as well. I wasn't totally convinced that the Education Achievement Authority was the way to go, maybe for parts of the state, but maybe we need to be a little more discerning on what we do in the entire state. So to see this move, I understand why he's doing it. He action and he likes improvement, and I think he probably believes he can get that under his own jurisdiction.
Now, for those that don't know how the process works, the guidelines for when districts are being classified or designated in financial crisis, and did this all come from the formation of the EAA down to deal with the Detroit schools? Is this a Board of Education set of guidelines? Do you, as the members of the legislature, who set those policies as to here's a district, it now faces a trouble, here's the next step in the process?
Well, the last term, we did try to at least set some parameters, how many, what's your graduation rate, you know, and we always look at things like that. Senator Howard Walker, who's no longer serving, he decided to retire, but he put together some information, decided to list, you know, how many students you have, just so we could get a handle a little bit earlier on districts that may be on precipitous ground. And that never actually made it all the way through the legislature last term. So without that guideline, and there are many things that we do look at as a state. It goes into this Department of Education. Schools report a great deal of information. We just need to utilize it, and maybe we're missing something, and Howard was trying to address that, but this will be interesting to see how this works specifically for these failing districts.
At the beginning of the week, the lead story was that the governor said in a statewide call-in to the public radio audiences that there was no plan B to deal with the roads should the ballot proposal on May 5th not pass. And as we sit down, it was also earlier this week that Republican Representative Gary Glenn said he was supporting or would be supporting legislation similar to the proposal last year from the House that says it can raise the $1.2 billion the governor wants without raising taxes. We know the dynamic where House had a plan, didn't go through the Senate, Senate had a plan that didn't go through the House. As a returning member from then and now in the Senate, where do you see the context of those two plans and now the setting that we have that deals with the vote on May 5th?
This has been an issue that's been looked at from every angle, I would hazard a guess. The governor proposed his particular plan. I'm sure he probably does not have his own plan B. The House proposed their plan. The Senate, we tried to actually do an increase in the sales tax cleanly without additional items involved. Could never reach that 2/3 vote to get that on the ballot in the Senate or the House. So ultimately the Senate sent over a gas tax increase, which really we know that in the long term won't be sufficient simply because people are driving fewer miles, people are driving fuel-efficient cars, and now you have electric cars on top of that. So your gas tax will probably not keep up with the rate needed to keep these roads drivable. So now we're looking at this ballot proposal. And it's somewhat complex and difficult to understand and difficult to explain to people. I do know there are folks in the House and the Senate who are looking at options should this plan fail. And I believe, I don't know if they're both all on Transportation Committee, but I know they're looking at them. So to say there's no Plan B, there are people looking at Plan B somewhere. And we'll just see what happens here in the next few weeks.
What about the built-in structural problem to all of this that predates your time in the state government? And I'm not sure what year it was pegged, where we had state gas tax at that time, part of that going then to schools, not to roads, and some say this was put together back here somewhere is part of the problem we find ourselves in. A Plan B or the degree to which this proposal addresses the school funding. Some say that $300 million will be coming back around just because of the increase in the sales tax to fund the schools, but it won't be tied to a gas tax because the gas tax will be going to the roads, and this gets right to, as you put it very clearly, a very complex nature. In the end, do we have something that addresses all of those concerns, local governments, the schools, and the roads, with this proposal, or do you see that coming from somebody's Plan B?
This plan that's on the ballot does address all those issues. It does address our roads, it does address our schools, and it addresses local government as well. There are other things involved, and quite frankly, you know, it's a complex issue. Although we know that our roads are breaking up and we know what we need to fix them, we're fortunate in this area in that we have additional money coming from the tribe. They're very generous. And other areas of the state, not so much. What I see really is our local roads are very, very in need of some attention. So it will address it, but you have to weigh the question, what are you willing to pay?
Better economic times have allowed the state to set aside money in the so-called rainy day funds, not only the general fund but the school aid fund. But on top of that, tax credits tied to new job hiring, another sign of better economic times, are triggering the set of claims on those, and a long cycle we could see of that impacting the budget and shortfalls. Now plans in various forms to move money from the general fund from the school aid fund, I may have that backwards, to use some of those surplus dollars. At the end of the day, in balancing this and perhaps future budgets, how much do we still have in reserve, and why was there a sense in the calculation that we needed to move from one rainy day fund to another to quote-unquote balance this out? That I found very confusing this week also.
Well, interestingly enough, I think many of us found that confusing. I no longer serve on appropriations, so I know there were probably some negotiations and just some discussions held on how to address this. This was an anticipated hit to the budget, and you know, when you're comparing things like making sure that your health departments have funding versus other things, tough decisions to make, and we want to be judicious, we want to be frugal, we want to be responsible with the state's income, because it comes from our citizens, and it takes a great deal of negotiation to get to a point where everyone will find something that they can support and vote for, because you're not going to agree with everything that comes forward, and there's never going to be that perfect piece in a budget that everyone loves. So I would say there's probably going to be more ongoing discussion about this issue.
If we look at a cycle that could go out as far as, I think I've heard, the year 2032 of these claims, it may not equal the current $300 to $500 million we're facing right now, but with anything on the level of that type of a hit to the budget, even though acknowledging you say you're not on the Appropriations Committee, what are all of you beginning to say in terms of, okay, well, we've got some surplus that we can borrow from now, now, but how good will the economics of the state have to be to allow us to meet these challenges, plus perhaps still put some into the reserves?
The economics of the state are going to have to be very good, and really we have surplus to borrow from simply because we were very responsible the last 4 years in making sure that we shored up what we were lacking. I mean, I will tell you, serving in the House, there were times when we knew the cash flow was dire in the state of Michigan. So we made it a priority to make sure we weren't in that position again, to make sure there was money in the fund and we wouldn't just be flying.
Big numbers that we've been talking about. A single-digit number, and that's the number 2, but this may be as troubling, if not more so, than any we've spoken of. A dubious ranking, number 2 for the level of human trafficking, and we've spoken many times on this program and in many settings, and recently more work with you in your office regarding this for reports for CMU Public Radio News as well. All of the legislation you've worked to put together to get passed, perhaps still a work in progress, comment on that number 2 ranking and where we see those trends.
And that's unfortunate. And we knew that when we were doing our research on this legislation, that we were a high number state, that our volume was far more than anybody would want. And of course, we're close to an international border. We're close to a hub like Toledo. Toledo's right up there. You can get anywhere, north, south, east, west, in a very short period of time. Every survivor we've spoken with at one time or another has come through Detroit, but not just Detroit. You have little airstrips all across the state where people can land and take off and without detection. So we realize we have much more to do. We're grateful that we got 21 bills passed in the House and the Senate and signed into law. Some significant improvements. I'll just highlight the statute of limitations. Previously, a survivor had 6 years to go after their trafficker. We now have it at 25 years. I'd like to totally eliminate it, but if we can't get there yet, I'll accept the 25 years. So that's an improvement, because a survivor usually doesn't recognize, and it's tough for people to understand that, but it's a psychological issue. They don't recognize that they were manipulated, coerced, and trafficked until years later, until they've had some emotional support and therapy. So we have more to do. We have more to do addressing what's going on with our children, and primarily through the internet, cybercrimes.
Did the process, when you first went into the very substantial effort to take this on, obviously the goal would be to eliminate it altogether. Did you see it as much of an incremental process that we were going to have to get to this first, to this next? Was there a hope that you could get to this, but because politics is politics, you had to settle for something a little bit less? That incremental, and I guess the question of where you still see the biggest challenge. What's the main part of all of this in those 20-plus bills that is the lacking piece? You mentioned the efforts to deal with cybercrime and the internet, but an essence of where we still have the biggest steps to make.
A couple places probably. One of the biggest steps, and I sound like a broken record, one of the first steps is making sure that people know what they're seeing. People are aware, because this is an issue that's right next door, in your backyard, in your church, in your school. Wherever you may be, there's probably someone there who's being victimized. And we recognize that the medical professional community, they aren't always aware, because we're not even talking about that in med schools, medical training. So we're working on that. That was a piece of the legislation to put the board together, and they just announced the board, the Health Advisory Board for Human Trafficking, a couple weeks ago, and they will put together essentially a handbook for the medical community, and then we'll work with medical schools to get the information there. But that's just one piece of the puzzle. It's all of us. And I think the other piece, it's the awareness piece, and then the other piece is the fact that we need to make sure our law enforcement agencies have people who are trained in cyber forensics. That's where we find people. That's where we can get the information. That's where we can actually step in and prevent something from happening.
Is that more of a training that they don't have, or don't have as much that we need to do more in the development of?
We need to do more.
Yeah.
We have folks who are trained in it, but they'll be retiring, and we haven't kept up with the training for additional individuals following them. So there's potential there. We know that trafficking has increased because people are turning from other crimes and turning to trafficking. It's a very easy thing to do, and it's lucrative, and your product, you can sell that product multiple times. So more to do, but we're making progress, and it is a slow process. You think to yourself, you take on this and you say, who's going to be against bills that get rid of human trafficking or attempt to? But every little piece is a little different, and it was a process, and we're happy with the results, but not happy enough to stop.
You mentioned something I thought was very interesting in this, and talking about literally the areas of the state, and especially when we look at this district that you represent in your hometown and the areas kind of north, we see pockets where we have some population. There are some vast open spaces. We've got the corridor that goes up the middle of the state, and then a lot of these state roads, and you mentioned, the small airstrips. If we put states along kind of in a map and look at just the unique way a state is laid out, do you think it's made Michigan more vulnerable to it? Because we would assume that something like this is going to be, well, this has got to be a New York City problem. This is a Chicago or an LA problem, because you've got the huge settings with all those people. But the fact that we have these open spaces, has that made us more susceptible or more able to become prevalent and unfortunately rank as high as number 2, number 5?
Probably so, and of course, different types of trafficking. You think of the urban areas, suburban areas, but in our area, we know of individuals who were trafficked during hunting season, during times like that. So opportunity is everywhere, and yes, Michigan, and it's a large state. I mean, you can travel a long distance and hide out. It's just different types, and the best thing we could do is just get rid of the demand. It's the law of supply and demand. If there's no demand, there's no product to offer.
And we note again the work of our radio reporter, Ariel Breen, working with your office. You can find those reports that include the comments of Senator Emmons at WCMU.org. Click on radio and WCMU.org/news. Interesting development in that earlier we had some move on medical marijuana, and then kind of superseded or trumped almost by the announcement that there's a coalition that may want to put a full legalization measure on the 2016 ballot. There's the question of the day: should marijuana be legalized?
Interesting. It's an interesting concept. Actually, had spoken to some legislators from Colorado. And they were aware of what was going on here in Michigan, and they just cautioned us, be very aware of what you're doing, because they're seeing a great increase of children getting edibles, things like that, and it's a great concern out there. So I think we need to watch what happens there, see where we can avoid that, but I don't know. We'll see if the will of the people are willing to take a look at that. We looked at it once. We didn't get it right the last time, so we'll see if people are willing to take a chance.
And I'm going to assume here, not getting it right would be the rather vague language of the medical marijuana piece that was, or the ballot measure that was passed by the voters. And since then, the court challenges, the bills that all of you have had to come back and do to try to clarify what was simply too open, what seems to be, on many agree, too open-ended of a policy. One of those is the thing that we alluded to earlier, which is landlords being able to restrict tenants' use within rental units. Now, at the same time, then, literally within a few days comes the word that there may be a push for full legalization. So where do you see a butting of the heads or a collision course perhaps coming down the line between now and 2016?
Well, you're going to have a lot of discussion, no doubt about that. And certainly the whole issue with the landlords, really it was an issue with folks growing it, not being aware that folks were growing it in the rental property and really impacting the value of the property and the structure. So a lot of facets to something like this. One thing always impacts someone else or something else, and it's just being responsible.
Another measure that came from the House, and we assume in the back and forth that this will be coming to your chamber in the Senate, a bill that would eliminate the $50 million per year the budget that's being spent on film and television incentives. We saw the number go up, go down. We literally outbid New Mexico and other states when this was initially put in. Now, as we look at budget issues and whether or not it's paying its way and so forth, where would you stand? Where do your colleagues in the Senate look at this as it potentially comes over to your side?
This is going to be interesting because, and of course, a lot of new folks in the House, they're getting their feet under them and getting a sense of how the budget works. We in the Senate had worked on this previously. I know that there will be discussion because it's going to be completely different bills probably addressing this. Really, when you get to an issue like this, you have to come down to, especially when your budget is starting to get tight, you have to come down to the decision, where's your return on the investment? You know, if your health departments are being cut in the middle of the year and you're not getting the return on the investment of the $50 million you thought you were going to get, maybe you ought to cut your losses and stick to taking care of your health department. You know, that's just one example of how you try to balance a budget and yet maintain an economic driver in the state.
An address being given perhaps literally as we sit down and talk here today from the governor regarding energy policy. We are in the year when we were supposed to get to the level of 10% of renewable energy production by 2015. Many were then wanting us to be ramping along to 25% by 2025. Now again, the give and take and not having the text of what the governor's address is going to be. You're in an area where there's a lot of wind production. Your district has that large wind farm down through Gratiot County. Should we move to another portfolio? Should we stick to the 10%? What should we do?
This is going to be an interesting discussion. We've seen how it's worked these last few years, and what I'm understanding for our area there in Gratiot County, it is much more productive than even they anticipated as far as the generation capacity. So they're building more, if I understand it correctly, and it's being utilized. I don't know where we're going to come down on this. I think the House has a different perspective than the Senate, and it will be full-time entertainment if you want to go to any of those energy and tech committees, because this is going to impact all of us. You know, and you really do have to get to a point where you ask yourself, how much can people afford to pay for electricity? We're a high-cost state. And you can't make people choose between their electricity and their food budget. So we have to weigh that in everything that we're doing.
As much as we see coming in these new forms of power to the grid, whether it be solar, whether it be the wind farms that you mentioned, Senator Ken Horn, when he was here last week on the program, reminded everyone that there is still a need for base load power, that the reliability of hydropower, wind power, solar power, anything that is a renewable sense or an alternative energy source, that there is still the need, and yet at the same time, federal policies are dictating that the base load, the coal-fired power plants are being phased out, not being replaced. Where does that leave us as we, there are days when you can drive down that corridor and see amount of that grid not being fueled because the turbines aren't turning.
That's right, that's right. And probably you could never, turbines would never produce all that we need. It's going to have to be a blend of many things. In Michigan, it makes sense to utilize natural gas. But as my colleagues have pointed out when we've had discussions, you're talking about really just making sure there's that standard, that base that you can't build out quick enough. If they get rid of coal plants by a year or two from now, I don't know that we'll be ready for that, and that's a concern as well.
Lots of things that we were able to touch on, and even things that could be changing shape just because of events going on as we sit down today before our audience even catches up with this. But as always, we appreciate your time out of a busy schedule to address all of those. Good to have you back. Thanks.
It's my pleasure.